Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here for what I hope will be a really fun video. I am combining two really popular booktube videos into one. So I'm going to do my TBR for 2022, so a list of books that I really want to get to next year. But these aren't just any books, but particularly they're going to be books that I believe are going to be 5 stars. So this is also a 5-star prediction video. And the reason I want to do this now is I'd like to be able to go back later and look back on this video and see if the books that I predicted in this video end up on my best of the year list at the end of 2022, so we can reflect on that later on and see how well I did. This is going to be a combination of front list and backlist books, so I'm going to include some books from my anticipated list as well as some backlist books that I've just been meaning to get to for way too long and have just been burning a hole on my TBR. I'm going to have this broken out into horror and thrillers and then science fiction and fantasy. I will have timestamps down below if you're only interested in certain genres. And hopefully this will be a lot of fun. I would love to hear your comments down below on what you think of my predictions. First, let's talk horror, and I've got to be honest, of all the categories, this is the toughest one to make a predictions list for because I tend to be really picky with the genre. I love horror, but I also can be just really tough on it. I think that I give it tougher reviews because I've read so much, so I have really high expectations. And that being said, I do think I have some really good books picked out that I do think have a really good shot of being new favorites. The first one is probably the strongest guess on this list, and that is Such a Pretty Smile by Christy DeMeester. This, of course, is a story of a small town where there is some kind of creature or entity that is targeting young women, but not just any women. Particularly, it's focusing on the women that just won't shut up and smile pretty. Instead, they just go against the grain and stand out. And I want to put this on my predictions list for a few reasons. One being the fact that I read the author's previous book, Beneath, and that was a favorite the year I read it. And so I definitely think her newest book has favorite potential as well, especially because of the subject matter and themes. You know I love fierce feminist horror, and this sounds right up my alley. Honestly, I'll be shocked if it doesn't make the list, and I'll be shocked if it doesn't end up really high on there. It's right at the beginning of the year, so you'll hear my review pretty soon, and yeah, I'm dying to check it out. Then, sticking with frontlist picks, I also want to put on my list Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, which, yes, ended up on both my anticipated list videos because I couldn't figure out which one I wanted to talk about it on, so I just did both. And this, if you missed those videos, is a piece of space horror following a crew that go to investigate a ship that shows up years after it disappeared, and well, possibly it's haunted, there's weird sounds, there's flickering lights, and it sounds amazing. This is a book I'm going into with really high expectations, and so I'm hoping that they can possibly live up to the actual experience, and I'm just dying to get into this one. You know I love horror and I love science fiction, especially set in space, so again, it has so much promise. So this is either going to be a new 5-star or a huge disappointment because I'm just, again, dying to read this one, and it sounds so good. Do not let me down. I want this to be another favorite. Then I have one more horror new release I want to talk about, but this one actually is not on my previous video of anticipated releases because it doesn't come out till August, but I'm dying to get my hands on it, and that is Piñata by Leopoldo Golt. And this is a story of a young Mexican woman with 2 daughters. They go off to work in Mexico on a project, and then soon after things go wrong and they end up going back home to the States. However, they begin to worry that something followed one of their daughters home and she is acting strangely. I am very excited for this one for a few reasons. One being the fact that the author wrote one of my favorite horror stories, Ghost Radio, which does not get talked about enough. It's a really wonderful hidden gem that I personally love, and so I've been dying to read more by this author. And the premise itself sounds right up my alley again because it sounds like it might be a possession story. You also know that I do love a lot of Mexican-inspired horror, especially Own Voices. And yeah, it just checks a lot of boxes that could really help me to get this book up on my horror list for 2022 and hopefully right up at the top, because yeah, it sounds like it's going to be right up my alley and check all of my Rachel boxes. Then switching to backlist horror, I also want to read Experimental Film by Gemma Files, and this is a story that follows a mother with a young autistic son, and she works in the Canadian film industry. And that's about all I know about the plot, but those things alone make me very interested in it. I am always looking for stories involving neurodiversity. It's something you don't see a lot of in horror, or at least not done well, I should say. And there is autism within my larger family, so it is something that I'm always looking specifically for. And of course, you know I'm Canadian, so anytime a story involves a Canadian setting, I am very much here for it. I don't actually know tons about the Canadian film industry, so I'm hoping I will find those parts interesting, because I have heard it's a major part of the story. But yeah, I just have high hopes for this one. It's been sitting on my TBR, just again burning a hole, and it's about time I checked it out. Then finally for horror, I want to predict that I'm going to love Animosity by James Newman. This, I understand, is a horror story about a fictional horror writer whose real life begins to mirror that of his books. It's a setup I think that's been done before, but it's just one I'm very interested in and sounds like a lot of fun. I love horror books that get really meta, and I believe this is one of Edward Lauren's all-time favorite books. He's another YouTuber. Highly recommend his channel if you haven't somehow checked him out. And I've read, of course, James Newman before and really liked his previous work, particularly Midnight Rain ended up on my favorites list I think a couple years ago, and I really wanted to read more by him since. So this one, yeah, sounds very promising and definitely, again, has that potential. So we'll see if it lives up to my hype. Then switching over to science fiction, I want to predict that I'm going to love The Cashew Prevention Society by John Scalzi. And this is set in the current time, following the global events that are happening right now. And it follows a man who ends up getting wound up into this plot to help save animals, but not animals on our world, but in another dimension. The story sounds absolutely kooky, and if it was written by another author, I don't think it would be on this predictions list, but I really like John Scalzi. To be fair, while I've liked his work, I've never actually given a book 5 stars, but I really liked Lock In, I really liked Old Man's War and some of his other books, and again, I'm just hopeful for this one. I believe I'm getting a review copy, but I also am excited because I know that Will Wheaton has done some of his other books on audio, so if I like it, I might end up using an Audible credit to purchase and read it that way as well. And so if I reread it over the year with Will Wheaton's narration, it might hit that sweet spot and again hit that 5-star mark that I'm looking for. Next, I want to predict The Derivative Base by Mary Robinette Kowal. This is the 4th book in the Lady Astronaut series that is supposed to come out towards the end of 2022. So as long as that happens, this one has a high chance of ending up on my favorites list. And this, if you don't know, is a piece of historical science fiction following a character who gets put into the space program. They're one of the first lady astronauts when the space program is expedited. And this story particularly goes back to the first main character, Alma. And the only book in the series that has technically gotten a full 5 stars from me was the 3rd book, because I really liked Nicole's perspective. So the only thing holding this book back from that potential is the fact that I like Nicole more than Alma. But at this point, I've really fallen in love with the series. So I think the fact that I believe it's supposed to be the last book gives it a really good shot of making me love it. I just can see myself getting really emotional if it all comes together with some great character development and moments, as I know the author is going to deliver. So definitely a potential as long as it gets released on time. Then switching to backlist sci-fi, I really want to read House of Suns by Alistair Reynolds. This is the book that I've heard really amazing things about. I know Moyd, if you follow his channel, it's one of his all-time favorite books by him. I understand that it is a space opera that is a standalone, unrelated to his Revelation Space series, and I believe it involves cloning and artificial intelligence, which are 2 themes in science fiction that I absolutely love. And I do have a copy of the audiobook, which is done by John Lee, who is a fantastic narrator. And so there's so many things that are lining this up to making this a really good possibility of being a new favorite. And I would really love to read more Alistair Reynolds next year, so that's gotta happen. Next on the TBR is A Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vitch, and this is a space opera book I honestly know very little about, but I know that again Moid loves this book, I know my friend Michael from Fit to Be Read loves it, and I have a commenter, Redfoot, yes, I'm looking at you, who has recommended me this book several times, and I just think I'm really gonna love it. I liked it enough to buy a copy, which I rarely do for an unread book, and I'm dying to get into this one. I think I mistakenly said in my book haul that this was a classic science fiction, but I understand it's actually a fairly recent release, like it came out in the last few decades, but regardless, I need to check it out. It sounds so good, and I haven't seen anyone not love it, so I don't want to be that one unpopular opinion. Then finally for science fiction, I want to go with Wool by Hugh Howey, which is the first book in a trilogy. I understand this is set in a dystopian future where the air outside has become toxic, so everyone needs to live inside of silos. And if you go against the society and get in trouble, you are forced to go outside and clean the windows with wool. And it's basically a death sentence. I've heard amazing things about this book and this series. It's supposed to have amazing twists and turns and just be very thrilling and unique. I don't actually typically enjoy a lot of like dystopian post-apocalyptic type books, but this one just sounds very different. I think it's something that is a little bit outside of that normal box, and so as long as it is a little bit, like I said, different, I think this one could really work for me. Again, so many people have loved it, and I have high hopes that I will join in the crowd. Finally, switching over to fantasy, this is another kind of wild card category because while I don't read a lot of fantasy, I tend to really enjoy the fantasy books that I do complete because I kind of pick up and DNF a lot that you never really hear about on my channel. But the first one I want to go with is a 2022 release, and that's actually a sequel called Lachlan's by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the third and final book in the Founders trilogy, and I really enjoyed this fantasy setting. The first book involves a thief who steals something, and the story just involves a lot of the tropes I really enjoy. It has some really cool hard magic that almost reads like coding, and it just has some really good character work, some queer representation, and a magical sidekick character that I absolutely adore in the first book. And because this is the final book in the trilogy, I do think it could be a favorite. The first two books were really solid 4-star reads, but they didn't quite make the 5-star cut. But again, as the finale, I think that this one could really push it up a notch, hit me in those emotional feels, and give me a really satisfying ending because I felt like it's really building towards a very dark, epic conclusion, and I really hope that that is the case. Next for fantasy, I want to predict that I am going to love the final book in the Dandelion Dynasty, and that is Speaking Bones by Ken Liu. This is a piece of historical Chinese-inspired fantasy that I've been absolutely loving, and so again, because this is the last book in the quartet, I really think that the author is going to bring it home and hit me in all the emotional feels, so very high hopes that this is going to be on my favorites list, and honestly, I'd be shocked if it's not. Next, we have Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. This is the last 2022 release I'm going to be mentioning here. This was in my anticipated release video. And this is another Asian-inspired fantasy. I understand it follows a young woman who is hidden away because her mother stole an object from the emperor. And the girl ends up having to go on the run, some magical powers possibly start to awaken, and she ends up going to the court and the school where the prince is actually there, and they end up becoming friends and classmates and working together, learning the magic and fighting of this land. And I'm very excited for this one. Again, I love Asian-inspired fantasies, so that alone makes this book a really high contender for my favorites list. I am a teeny bit nervous because I can be a little bit finicky when it comes to romance, and I'm pretty sure there are going to be some sparks flying between this young woman and this young prince, but that being said, there are times that it really does work for me, and so as long as it's not too like sickly sweet, I think I can get on board for it. And yeah, I've heard amazing things. I know another booktuber, Tammy, really loved this one and gave it an early gushing review, and so again, I think that this one is really going to hit the nail on the head and be, again, a book that will check all of my Rachel boxes. Then for fantasy, we have Perdido Street Station by China Mieville. And this, I understand, is super weird fantasy that kind of blends in some elements of steampunk. I don't even know much of the plot, but it's one that is highly regarded. I believe this is a favorite of my good friend Thomas from SFF 180. And so I really would like to read this one sooner than later. And I'm hoping it works for me. I know it's not science fiction and it's not dark fantasy, but I'm okay with that. I've heard that it has like bug creatures and it's just really different. And that's always what I say I'm looking for fantasy, is I don't tend to like that really traditional fantasy with like knights and queens and princesses, but this just sounds so off the wall, so bananas pants crazy, and I'm really here for that. I've been dying to read China Mieville, and I think this is definitely where I'm going to start. And last, I want to predict that I'm going to love Upon a Burning Throne, which is the first book in an East Indian inspired fantasy series. And I don't know too much about the plot. I know it involves gods. It's supposed to be epic in scale with a lot of different characters. And I have high hopes for this one because, again, I love diverse fantasy. And I know several of my friends who I tend to have similar tastes to really enjoyed it, like Jessie May, and I believe Lena from Sufficiently Advanced Lena also loved this one. And so I'm just dying to get into it. And then there's a sequel, and I think the third book is coming out here. It's a translated work, and yeah, I've heard a couple mixed reviews, but most of the people who, again, have tastes similar to me seem to absolutely love it. So I'm really crossing my fingers that I will love not only the first book, but the entire series. And it's pretty big in terms of scope, so hopefully that'll keep me busy for a while. So that's it for this video here. I would love to hear the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? And also, which books do you think I was correct in my predictions? If you leave a comment down below, you can come back at the end of 2022 and see if your predictions were correct. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, fantasy, and science fiction. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving me a thumbs up, or if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.